This morning's homilist is Eric Schuman. Eric first joined the church in 1963 at the age of 15, and through his college years, he intended to pursue a UU ministry. After spending 3 years as a community organizer and civil rights worker, his life took an alternate path, and for 45 years, he practiced medicine as a physician's associate. In the 1980s, Eric served as a church president in Kansas and as president of the Prairie Star District of the UUA. After retiring, Eric attended Star King UU Seminary in Berkeley as a special student. Today, Eric spends much of his time volunteering with his therapy dogs in hospitals, nursing homes, and with hospice patients. He founded a chapter of End of Life Choices Oregon to assist people interested in utilizing death with dignity. He is a member of the UU congregation in Salem, Oregon, where he serves as a lay minister. And I'm looking forward to what Eric has to say. Now, we'll go to Bob Meyerson, and he will do the chalice lighting.
Good morning. Chalice lighting words today. May this light enter and illuminate every dark corner of our world, and to bring understanding to all those who harbor dark thoughts about their fellow humans. Now let's hear some more music.
I know this rose will open. I know thy fear will burn away. I know my soul will unfurl its wings. I know this rose will open.
I know this rose will
I know this rose will
I know
open.
this rose
I
will
know
open.
this rose
I
will
know
open.
my fear
I know my fear will burn away. I know this rose will unfurl its wings. I know this rose will open. I know this rose will open. I know my fear will burn away. I know my soul will unfurl its wings. I know this rose will open.
So there were a couple of quotes that I think are appropriate for opening words. The first is by The first is by Nikola Tesla, somebody I'm sure you've all heard of. It is paradoxical, yet true, to say that the more we know, the more ignorant we become in the absolute sense. For it is only through enlightenment that we become conscious of our limitations. Precisely one of the most gratifying results of intellectual evolution is the continuous opening up of new and greater prospects. And the other one is from Carl Sagan. Every one of us is, in the cosmic perspective, precious. If a human disagrees with you, let him live. In 100 billion galaxies, you will not find another. And with that, I would like to give you Eric.
I have a couple of readings to share with you. Many years ago, the UUA used to annually produce a meditation manual. And in 1978, the author of that manual was Reverend David O. Rankin. And this particular manual was called Portraits from the Cross. The first reading is called Sissy Jesus. Jesus was a sissy, a man who walked around the countryside without position, without possessions, searching for the meaning of life. a man who lingered lazily in the fields in order to study the flight of a bird and the beauty of a flower, a man who lived with the lowly, the oppressed, the sick, and the persecuted, protesting their condition, a man so physically frail he could not even carry his own cross to the top of the hill, a sissy. My thesis is inescapable. Jesus was a sissy. He was often sweet, kind, gentle, forgiving. He was always weeping, sighing, moaning, raving. He was often the victim of a very wild imagination. He freely touched other men, and I tremble to say it, he kissed them. And his hair was long, and his skirts were long too. A sissy. Yes, Jesus the Christ was an honest to God, real life, long-haired sissy. Judas was the man. And the other reading, which is the conclusion of this manual. So let me tell you a lesson I've learned in the ministry. I've learned not to take my position too seriously, or my image too seriously, or myself too seriously. I've learned that the most important item in the religious community is the people of the religious community. And I've learned that the real church can be defined as our most intimate relationships, how we smile and trust each other, how we talk and touch each other, how we share and protect each other, how we welcome new friends and forgive old enemies, how we love each other in all the myriad ways that love can be expressed. That is the church. I'm delighted to be with you this morning, and thank you so much for having me. In 2018, I was approached by the Association of Retired UU Ministers and their partners to contribute to a compilation of essays which included histories of LGBT persons within Unitarian Universalism. I'm going to begin with my history as a UU. Unbeknownst to my parents, in 1963, I joined a Unitarian Universalist congregation in suburban Maryland. I was 15. I'd already developed strong anti-racist views, and I became active in the struggle of African-American UUs for justice and equity in the UUA. Although I served on the board of trustees of our 1,000-member congregation, my views supporting Black empowerment weren't shared by most of our members. So I left there. I joined an inner city church in Washington, D.C., which was led by Reverend David Eaton, the most prominent Black minister in our denomination at the time. It was a place I could feel more at home. The story that I'm sharing with you today was published online in 2020. Subsequent to its publication, I was approached by Reverend Diana McLean, who was in the process of compiling essays on LGBTQ history for a book which was to be published by Skinner House Press, which is the in-house publishing arm of the UUA. I'm really delighted to report that the book, which is titled Defiantly Joyful, UU LGBTQ Stories Across Generations, is scheduled to be published this spring, and it will include this contribution. So allow me to begin. It was nearly Christmas 1982 when a brief article in the UU World struck me as rather odd. It announced a resolution to be voted on at the 1983 General Assembly, which would affirm the right of UU clergy to perform same-sex unions in our churches without interference from any board of trustees or fellow clergy. I wondered, what was the need for a resolution like this? That some UU clergy around the country were performing same-sex unions was no secret, and it wasn't a rare event. We hadn't heard of any repercussions to ministers performing these unions, so why the need for a resolution at General Assembly? Thinking about who might be well enough connected to know the answer, I phoned Reverend Frank Robertson. He was the minister of religious education at All Souls Church in Washington, D.C. Widely respected and well known in our movement, Frank was an out gay man who served on the UUA Board of Trustees. At the time, I was living in Topeka, Kansas, and we'd last seen one another earlier that year at a GA in Maine. So I asked Frank, "How are you doing?" And his reply really took me by surprise. He explained it had been the worst year of his ministry and that he was suffering from severe job-related stress caused by conflict with his senior minister, Reverend David Eaton, and the All Souls Board. This is the same minister I just mentioned to you earlier. Frank had performed a same-sex union at the church for two African-American women. And an article describing the event with an accompanying photo of the couple in the All Souls Sanctuary had been published in Jet magazine, which was read by many of the congregation's Black members. One of the things that had attracted me to All Souls was that its membership was about 50% Black. A number of lay people who objected to the wedding approached David Eaton, and they brought a resolution to the Board of Trustees which would prohibit same-sex unions from being performed in the sanctuary and forbade any clergy from participating except the senior minister. The new policy passed with unequivocal support from Reverend Eaton. Frank told me he was nervous about his tenure at All Souls and wondered if he would be terminated for his role in bringing attention to the church because of his support of gay marriage. In less than a year, he was either forced to resign or he was terminated. So here's what had happened. In an almost unbelievable coincidence, my phone call to learn about the reason for the resolution supporting same-sex unions was made to the minister who was victimized by the homophobia of the congregation whose actions had prompted this resolution. Now, I'd been a member of All Souls from 1969 to 70. I'd worked right alongside David Eaton in support of Black empowerment in the UUA, and I was deeply disappointed and angered with what I'd learned from Frank. I gave considerable thought to what I might say to David if I saw him at GA in Vancouver, BC the following year. Our paths did cross in a hallway. I told him he had missed a critical opportunity to support a different marginalized group of people, gay and lesbian people like me. I'd never come out to him. Well, he became defensive. He explained it was the will of the Black members of the congregation and that he was obliged to support them. He told me that I didn't understand Black folks, to which I replied that I recognized homophobia when I saw it, and I hoped that one day he would recognize it as well. I had a suggestion for him, that as a result of the policy that was passed by his board, they might want to consider purchasing a bus to be stationed in the All Souls parking lot. And instead of conducting services of union in the sanctuary, they could have the same-sex couples married in the back of that bus. He wasn't amused. That was the last time I would see David Eaton. The 1983 General Assembly was to prove critical in the history of the caucus called Unitarian Universalists for Lesbian and Gay Concerns. It was clear the group was at a turning point and needed to demand justice from the UUA for its lesbian and gay members. For most of the group, Same-sex union ceremonies represented the line in the sand. Nothing less than a strongly worded resolution endorsing same-sex relationships would satisfy our need for justice. Even so, I thought there was a more compelling issue. Two young ministers, Barbara Peskin and Ann Tyndall, were openly gay candidates aspiring to become co-ministers at Community Church in New York City, one of our urban churches which had been most successful at racial integration of its congregation. It was also known as one of the most progressive congregations in the city, championing many local issues regarding peace and justice. During candidating week, an open meeting of the congregation was called, where more than one member said they were appalled, horrified, and disgusted that lesbians could possibly become their ministers. One member recalled that speaker after speaker built up the hatred and the bigotry, calling Anne and Barbara scum and mutants. The vote to reject them was 55 to 38. Unfortunately, at the time, the climate in UU congregations was generally unfriendly to openly gay candidates. And although one openly gay man had been called to a pulpit in Maine, no openly gay women had. Discrimination in hiring was the rule, and the fact that gay and lesbian clergy had to hide their sexual orientation in order to be called to a pulpit was symbolic of the homophobia which was ubiquitous in our member congregations. Several gay clergy recounted stories of being rejected by a congregation when their professional packet included reference to their sexual orientation. And after removing the reference, they would be hired by a different congregation. And it was certainly standard practice to include reference to your sexual orientation in the packet that you were giving to this congregation considering you, because you would talk about your family. The wider denomination had to be aware of the problem because in 1980, there was a GA resolution called Ministerial Employment Opportunities, which issued a call to the churches, to the Ministers Association and the Department of Ministry to assist gay, lesbian, and bisexual religious leaders with settlement. So I argued that the Gay Caucus should devote its energy in the coming year to combat this blatantly homophobic practice, but my opinion was not to prevail. The majority of members preferred a year-long action directed at affirming same-sex unions. After the motion passed, the next step was to find a member willing to devote the time it was going to take to coordinate a binational campaign and get the resolution passed once and for all. As many of you know, Canadian congregations were then part of the UUA. At that time, I was serving as president of the 8-state region of the UUA called the Prairie Star District. After being defeated at GAs in 1982 and 83, the membership apparently believed I could wield influence which might be effective in gaining the resolution's passage. Although my heart was with the issue of discrimination in hiring, I was willing to take on the task because the caucus deemed it to be our first priority. 84 General Assembly in Columbus, Ohio was a UUA presidential election year. That was way back when they used to have contested elections. Remember that? Sandy Karen, UUA moderator, had announced her candidacy over a year earlier, and I'd had a chance to get to know her through my work as a district president. An attorney who regulated banking in New York State, she was intellectually sharp, assertive, and personable. She solicited my support, and I gave it willingly. Many months later, Reverend Bill Schultz announced his candidacy. He began working at UUA headquarters as director of the Office of Social Responsibility, and he became executive vice president during the term of President Reverend Eugene Pickett. I admired Bill's accomplishments, and we'd had opportunity to work together in planning a national observance of the Brown versus Board of Education Topeka Supreme Court decision in 1979, which was co-sponsored by the UUA and my home congregation in Topeka, Kansas. At a dinner Sandy Karen and I had together, I told her how concerned I was about the events at Community Church. I told her that if elected, I hoped one of her first priorities would be to raise consciousness regarding homophobia in hiring at the administrative and the congregational levels, and with administrative staff who assisted congregations seeking ministers. Sandy told me she'd risen to the top of the New York banking regulators in a nearly exclusive male world of attorneys. She said she faced sexism at every level, and that if she could break through those ceilings on her own, so could lesbian ministers. She would offer no support to out-of-closet lesbians seeking pulpits. I was appalled. I was uncertain how to proceed. Shortly before a district president's meeting in Boston, Bill Schultz phoned me to ask for a meeting in his office. It took me by surprise when he solicited my support for his candidacy, and I told him that as much as I admired him and would support him if he were elected, my support for a candidate had already been pledged to Sandy. Well, what would it take to change your mind? He asked. So I asked, did you know what happened to Ann Tyndall and Barb Peskin at Community Church? He said he did and was shocked by the congregation's homophobia. So I asked, what can you do about the issue of discrimination against gay and lesbian ministers seeking pulpits? Well, when I'm elected, I'll do everything possible to change the settlement process so this never happens again. But your responsibilities as executive vice president include the ministerial settlement process now. So what are you going to do now? I asked him. What would you suggest? Was his reply. At a meeting of the Prairie Star District Board in Minneapolis, a fledgling UU gay and lesbian group in that city asked for a grant of $234 to help with promotional expenses. So I spoke to my board on their behalf, but the motion died for a lack of a second. I was so angry that I considered resigning, but instead I decided to use district funds to hire a facilitator to conduct a workshop on homophobia and hiring practices in my own district. Reverend Morris Floyd was a United Methodist minister. He was working as the director of a lesbian and gay community center. His facilitation skills were brilliant, and he earned uniform praise in evaluations from our board. So I suggested Morris's name to Bill Schultz as a person who could facilitate homophobia training for the UUA board and the ministerial settlement representatives, and they were the people who were key to the process that was then utilized in hiring. After these settlement reps met in 1985, the hiring process administered by the denomination was changed. From the start, congregations seeking ministers were educated regarding the UUA's commitments to fairness in hiring, the denominational history of support for gay and lesbian rights, which included 6 resolutions passed at GAs between 1970 and 80, as well as support of women, people of color, and persons with disabilities. In 1988, a program called Beyond Categorical Thinking was implemented, which brought regional teams expert in fairness in hiring to congregations that were seeking ministers. From a 1988 personal correspondence with Reverend Charles Gaines, who was ministerial settlement director, I learned that in one survey performed by his department, 3% of respondents in a church seeking a minister would object to a Black candidate, and 37% to a gay or lesbian candidate. The denomination gave serious consideration to withholding settlement assistance from the church to any congregation which would not consider equally women, LGBT, persons of color, and disabled candidates. But the stick approach was rejected in favor of the carrot, that is, persuasion and education. In a 1988 letter to a past chair of the UUA Annual Program Fund, I wrote, UUA Executive President Kay Montgomery shared with me that perhaps more than any other issue now before the UUA, homophobia in settlement goes to the heart of who we are, and how we handle it will say a great deal about how seriously we choose to live our professed values, our purposes, and principles. She further describes the question as a profound moral dilemma, and I couldn't agree more. Well, I didn't have any experience coordinating a national political campaign, so after the '83 General Assembly, I consulted one of my most knowledgeable and experienced friends, Drew Cummins, UUA trustee representing Prairie Star District, and she was first vice moderator of the General Assembly. Drew explained that as long as services of Union resolution was categorized as a general resolution, it was unlikely to pass because it was competing with issues of global and national significance. The key to passage was to change the wording from one of support for same-sex unions to one requiring the expenditure of UUA staff time and money, which would qualify it as a business resolution. So I wrote the suggested language. Drew reviewed it, made some suggestions, and the campaign began. The newly worded business resolution supported freedom of the pulpit for clergy to perform same-sex unions without interference from their congregations, and mandated that the UUA publish tracts supportive of same-sex unions and materials for use by clergy in preparation for these celebrations. We sent the resolution to all the UUA districts for their endorsement. We asked them to submit it for inclusion on the '84 GA agenda. We encountered little difficulty in obtaining the required number of endorsements from the districts, but there were significant challenges from UUA legal staff and the GA Planning Committee, which repeatedly rejected our requests to change it from general to business. We persisted every possible venue, including the UUA board, which advised us to once again change the wording a little bit so it could withstand any challenge for inclusion as a business resolution. The board then submitted the resolution for consideration to GA itself with unanimous agreement of its members. By the mid-'80s, our caucus had become a significant presence in the denomination. Nevertheless, lesbians and gay men were routinely left out of decision-making at the highest levels. At a GA, UUA President Reverend John Burens announced the appointment of a task force on social responsibility to evaluate denominational efforts at social justice and social change, which would include racial justice, peace, and the Office of Lesbian and Gay Concerns. When he announced the members he'd appointed, and none was an openly gay man or lesbian, I added the matter to our caucus's agenda. We drafted a demand to John Burens and the UUA board that an openly gay man or lesbian be included on the task force. We nominated 2 prominent caucus members and included their credentials. The following day, a closeted lesbian minister we didn't recommend was added to the task force. She wasn't even out to her own congregation. This incident reminded me of the old saying, if you don't have a seat at the table, it's probably because you're on the menu. Caucus members and supportive friends from all over the US and Canada were involved in promotion of the resolution at the congregational and district levels. I coordinated strategy for the floor fight at GA, and I recruited key people from around the continent to speak in Columbus. When the issue came to the floor for discussion, it was clear we'd done our homework. the opposition seemed less organized and less eloquent. In contrast to the earliest gay-affirming resolution at a GA in the 1970s, which was proposing the formation of an Office of Lesbian and Gay Concerns, no one suggested that passage of this resolution would lead to further resolutions promoting bestiality. I am not kidding you. This happened on the floor of a GA, and the person who said that was one of the most prominent UU ministers of the 20th century, Reverend Donald Harrington of Community Church in New York City, the same church which rejected the two lesbian ministers. Well, we didn't have any idea what the outcome of this floor fight was going to be. But the services of union resolution passed by an overwhelming majority of delegates. We had no idea that reporters from the Associated Press would cover the vote, and we were surprised to see articles in the following day's New York Times and in newspapers all over the country. The Unitarian Universalist Association had become the first religious body in the world to endorse same-sex marriage. We couldn't have been more pleased. Bill Schultz was elected president, but some of our caucus members were deeply disappointed that the UUA failed to elect its first woman president or its first layperson as president. My strong support of Bill's candidacy among caucus members and my criticism of Sandy Caron for her opposition to changing the ministerial settlement process resulted in the loss of a few friends. Although I was hurt by this, there was no question in my mind that my efforts were worth the price I had paid and the long hours I spent in the previous year's work on behalf of change in the UUA. I've never regretted my decision, and I remain proud of the small role I was privileged to play in making the UUA more just toward LGBT ministers and same-sex couples who want to marry. Blessed be.
Thank you, Doug. I'm sure we will all spend several hours thinking about your sermon this morning. I know I will. As I extinguish the chalice, I have some closing words. Are we able to appreciate the humanity of all people and to revel and applaud the fact that part of being human is that each and every one of us shares that status, not in spite of, but because of our individual traits, beliefs, and differences? There is no typical human being. These individual differences are, in large part, the very reason for the progress of civilization. Extinguish this chalice with the hopes that some of the thoughts today will go out to the entire UU world. Doug?
I have been asked to make announcements, so let's see if I can do this. Okay, here we go. So you can find this information on the website, but here it is for you. There's two circles. There's a Tuesday circle and there's a Saturday circle. There is also our next month's service, our Saturday service. And I was asked to say we could use some donations. I guess I got to do this myself, huh? So here's some ways to donate. Again, this is on the website in more detail, but you can mail a check, you can use a credit card, or you can set up a recurring payment. And there's the website down at the bottom. I'm sure you all are familiar with that because you got here in the first place. So Does someone else have anything to add to the announcement? Something I didn't know about?
Looks like Levon had her hand up.
Yeah, go ahead,
Yeah,
Levon.
you have on the third Saturday service, you have the date wrong. It should be April 20th.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, you're absolutely right. All right, thank you for that.
Sure.
I guess that's it for announcements then. Back to you, Roy.
Okay. So I think that closes out our service, but we'll have discussion. We're not going to have breakouts. We decided that. We're just going to talk as a group because we feel like it's not too many people to have our voices heard. So thanks. I want to thank Eric. I very much appreciate what he had to say. A lot of food for thought. Thank you, Eric. And thanks, Doug, for the music. Doug Rogers provided the music today. I think his wife was playing the piano, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. Yeah, well, just briefly, when COVID hit, I offered to record the services because I knew how to do that. And I ended up, well, there's a whole team doing it. And then I ended up just doing the music. So I spent almost 2 years every Friday recording musicians from all over town, including my wife and some other friends. And you saw a little bit of that today. So anybody interested in that kind of work, music recording, editing, and so forth, why get in touch with me and maybe we can do some things.
Right. So one thing I need to do is stop the recording. So